I'm joined today by Dale and Dustin here, so we'll introduce everybody in just a moment. But this session is going to be all about the concept of developer advocacy and champions programs and helping application security teams understand the lives of their counterparts in engineering, and also the other way around. We had a conversation about this in the previous LeanAppSec, which is available on demand, and you can watch that on the LeanAppSec website. But there we focused more about building champions programs. We're going to talk about that a little bit. We might even build our own little champions programs in the following hour. We'll see how it goes. But we also want to talk about the other way around. How do we enable the application security teams, especially the ones who have to serve very large engineering teams? How do we enable them to really understand their counterparts? So let's start with very brief introductions so we just know who we're dealing with here. So I have Dale with me here. Dale is an application security architect from AbbVie. Dale, can you briefly talk about kind of what you do your day-to-day? How did you end up here?
Well, I started as a electrical engineer doing firmware for Hewlett-Packard and Sun Microsystems way back, and then I just migrated right into application development and I've worked for DoD, large corporations. I've worked for startups in the AI field early on, and ran my own company for 8 years, writing applications for a vertical market. And now I'm just finished a stint at CMS for the healthcare modernization program, where they're now getting rid of or moving to AWS cloud. And now I'm at AbbVie. AbbVie is a international organization. We're in 138 countries with 50,000 plus employees. And I am doing AppSec for them. And that includes FDA and HIPAA requirements, GXP, which is general good practices, and the X is for manufacturing, healthcare, that type of stuff. And the company is starting some new initiatives, Secure by Design, and here I am. I've been here getting close to a year and helping with that initiative of Secure by Design. So big task.
Awesome. And we also have Dustin, Senior Director of Platform Security and Deputy CISO at Fivetran. Previously also Director of AppSec at Staples, right, Dustin?
Yep, that's exactly right. And then previous to that, I at school studied computer science and was a software engineer for over 13 years. So I worked in a variety of industries. Obviously worked for Staples. I worked in the DoD myself a little bit. I worked for video game companies, which was an interesting story. Then got into AppSec pretty naturally. I was always very interested in sort of the quality side of software engineering in general. So that was a very natural move over to security for me. And then jumped right in, led an AppSec team at Staples, like you mentioned. And then I've been at Fivetran now for about 2.5 years, where I basically built an AppSec team from scratch, team/program. And as a developer myself, I'm very interested in this topic. Happy to be here, by the way. Thank you for inviting me to this. I think developer advocacy is extremely important, trying to not just push for changes, but actually build relationships and show that you are on the side of the developers by providing training and so on. So I'm sure we'll get into that a lot more today, but it's definitely a big part of why I'm here in security in general.
So both of you have engineering background. So both of you wrote software for a living for at least a part of your career. Usually I wait a little bit before I send us completely off the rails in these panels, but it's interesting to me when you hire people for your teams. Do you try to emphasize people with software engineering background, with software development background, as a prerequisite to understanding application security and understanding engineers?
So for myself, I actually try to hire diversely. I think there are a lot of different skills that make up a good AppSec team. And but certainly the folks who are engineers who are interfacing often with developers, I do look for that software engineering background. And it's for a few reasons. One of the big ones is because it buys clout to a degree with the developers, right? Like who are they talking to? Are they talking to an AppSec engineer that never did what they did? Or are they talking to somebody that knows the ins and outs of the things that they do every day as developers? And I think when you hire people that have that software engineering background, again, they just jive better. There's more of a click between the AppSec person and the developer, which I think is huge. So certainly I look for that.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Paul? Are you looking for that skill set in people that you work with, or not so much?
Yes. However, AppSec is kind of a wide, broad topic in that when I first moved into AppSec, the majority of people in that job were from the IT operations side, and they were working on the right side of an application, pen testing, red teaming, et cetera, which are all AppSec.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody was really talking to the developers, and if they were, it was only for compliance, problems. And the everybody talks about shift left, but then what happens there is, you kind of throw a tool on there that all of a sudden now becomes a ball and chain for the development department. And for high performance development teams, you really can't tax them the way it's been done historically in, say, a waterfall approach. You got teams that are agile. So they want to, if they're high frequency, they've read the book Accelerate, and they're somebody like Facebook or Twitter, they don't have time to chase down false positives. They don't have the time to do a lot of things. So you find a lot of shortcuts taken. But I can walk in there now and I can design a security program based around the developer because I feel their pain. I know if I dump 1,500 CVS scores on them and say, fix it in 3 weeks, they're going to have trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Just don't have the manpower for it or time. So you really kind of have to tailor and you have to get adoption. And the first people that need to adopt AppSec on the left side is the developers, and being able to speak their language and know their pain and having been there. It's very important. So if I'm hiring an AppSec person, if they're to work with the SAST, SCA, side of the house, I want a developer. If they're working on WAFs and firewalls and the edge devices, I'll take an ops person.
Yeah.
So it's kind of it's a village. It's a broad spectrum.
It's interesting that you talked about shift left being sort of a ball and chain on the first LeanAppSec that we did. Rachit Lohani, who's the CTO at Paylocity, that he owns both engineering and security there. He made the point that shift left in a lot of companies, you only shifted the responsibility left or the blame left, but you didn't shift the actual enablement in terms of how do you actually do security further left in the process. Let's start actually from the beginning. Before we started recording, you talked about developer advocacy kind of versus the traditional champions programs. What do you see as developer advocacy in the context of an application security team?
Yeah, it's kind of a champion on the security side to a degree. Like we talk about having developers learn more about security so that they can be security champions for their teams. This kind of developer advocacy concept is sort of the opposite of that, where you have security folks learning more about development and specifically what the developers are doing or working on so that they can be advocates for them on the security side as well. And I think that's like, to me, that is just a very basic prereq for being effective as a security team in general, right? Like you need to understand what are the developers working on. What are the projects that they're doing? What are the things that they think about and care about? If you're just rolling in as a security team and it's just this compliance driven office of no, do what I say type of situation, that's not going to work out very well, right? But if it's more of an empathetic listening, tell me more about your challenges, tell me about the things going on, what are you working on, where is your time allocated, and so on, becomes more of a two-way conversation, right? And this is kind of the cloud that I was talking about earlier. In order to successfully influence change at your organization, you need to be open to listening, right? And learning more about the pains and so on of the people that you're trying to reach. That's what it's all about to me. We talked about looking for folks that have a background in software engineering. I think that is very important. I think some of that can also be trained to a degree. I'd like to see more AppSec folks in general learning how to code. You do find AppSec folks that are fresh out of school. They have some sort of a cybersecurity focus. They're not going to be as effective, I would argue, as folks that have that hardcore software engineering background. So I would encourage AppSec people, or even just security people in general, to learn how to code. Get in there, start to understand how that world works if you want to be effective. And to me, that's huge. I think you can do that on your own time. I think there are opportunities to do this more internally as well. In the same way that we have like security training programs that we're pushing on developers, turn that around, flip it around, have the developers help the AppSec people learn how to code, right? And then they take the stage, which I think goes a long way as well. So that's what I would like to see. It's really just encouraging a two-way conversation. Developers learn about security, security folks learn about developers.
So Dale, in your situation and in your experience, especially when you have a very small application security team that has to serve just a huge amount of engineers, how do you even start to go about something like this?
Well, I use the word Sisyphus a lot because here I feel like I'm constantly pushing a rock up a hill. Education is key for both sides of the fence, from the security side and the developer side. And it's so broad. It's like, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? And that's essentially what I have to try and do, is prioritize identify them, prioritize the gaps in our process, and try and find out, if with the small program, what's the biggest bang for my buck, so to speak. Since we're on the initiative of Secure by Design, the advocacy program or developer champion program, where the security-minded developers help me, is they actually can take over that chore for me, and that they understand their team, they understand their processes, and they understand their tools. So by having a dotted line relationship between that champion and myself, it helps, because I only have to meet with them periodically and make sure that, I'm meeting their needs or helping them where they need it, smoothing through their pain points, learning security. But then there's the broader program of, threat modeling. Ask a developer if he's got a data flow diagram, and they're going to go, what? And they'll hand you an architectural diagram, not a data flow diagram. And so what's your data classification? What are the jewels that we're trying to protect here? So, we really have to, get some help, because obviously I'm not going to go sifting through their 4 databases that they typically have per app anymore, and I'm not going to necessarily learn, as an AppSec person, NoSQL, SQL, P-SQL, the whole ball of wax. So I got to rely on them. So there's this symbiosis that has to occur between the AppSec people and the developers. And my biggest goal right now is, how do I sell the adoption of an AppSec program on the development side of the house? From my reporting stack is more information security. I'm not under the CTO, like per your last discussion, where do you live under? And the information security doesn't necessarily understand the pain points. So I'm selling to both sides constantly. trying to make the information security understand what I need, and trying to work with the developers to tell them what information security needs for to manage the risk in the company. So
Would it
that's,
be would it be easier if you reported into the same organization as engineering, like into the CTO?
I had an inner debate with myself after watching the last LeanAppSec session about that discussion that they had, whether to be under the CISO or the CTO. And I initially landed on the fact that the CTO, you want that separation of duty, and the CTO's loyalty is going to be to get the product out the door. And he's going to be working with the engineering team. Then I got to thinking he'd probably understand what I'm trying to do better, but there's a difference in priorities between information security and the CISO and the CTO. So now I'm on I report under the CISO side and trying to convince them what the developers need. That's not really their background. So I really sometimes just wish I reported to both. You know, so but those are relationships that I've had to develop. Um, when I started here with the program, I actually didn't start with the developers. I started with all their managers, and I started with all the information security managers. And I went through and advocated for them to, how we want to set this up. And that's the elephant that you're eating a bite at a time.
100%. Dale, if I may jump in,
Yeah.
Dale, like you hit the nail on the head because I do see AppSec folks being kind of a bridge between developers and security and an advocate, for both sides to a degree, because I also find myself within the security team, trying to shift their mindset to kind of tailor or cater a little bit more to the developers' needs, because a lot of times they're very compliance driven, and not necessarily thinking about impacts and so on to developers. So it's a very interesting position to be in. I think that I personally prefer to be like have the CISO report to the CEO directly, not necessarily the CTO, because I do think that CTO's priorities are a little bit different, and it's good to have kind of that third party check and balance, if you will. So that's kind of where I land.
And
Yeah,
how do you? Yeah, go ahead, Dale.
I was just going to say, when I hear the word CISO, call me old-fashioned, but that's Chief Security Officer. CTO is Chief Technology Officer. They're both chiefs. They
Yeah.
occupy the same level on the org chart, and they both report up to a single person. And most organizations is either the Chief Risk Officer, which is, to me, seems like it's something new, and prior to that, the Chief Financial Officer, because he's the one that had the right to checks for the 1 year subscription to Norton identity protection when they've had a breach. So, the financial officer was the risk officer. So
Yeah.
that keeps that delineation, but I've also worked under CTO/CSO, the combined role under one person, which again depends on their background and which side of the house they have a preference for. So I like the duality of that. I just don't, I'm like a man without a home, I feel sometimes.
Or many homes,
Yeah,
which is kind of the bridge that I was saying earlier. Like you kind of belong to both to a degree, because part of what your team does is engineering or advocating for engineers. Part of what you do is advocate for security.
Mhm.
So yeah.
yeah.
How do you manage? I have so many questions, but how do you manage that in terms of access? So, for example, something that we run into is the questions of can an application security engineer can they build software themselves? Do they have access? Do they own repositories? Right. This usually comes into play more in the world of SCA, maybe secret scanning, things like that, where there's a big question. You as the AppSec person, do you need a developer in the room? Do you have the skill set to do it yourself? Even if you do, would they let you? Do we have that level of trust? So Dustin, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to just put on the table is, I have not found the out of the box solution from vendors that you don't have to tailor, customize, etc. So I think you need people on your team that are able to write scripts, do that sort of development when it comes to tailoring and customizing tools. Okay, so you're going to have a repo, in my opinion, if you have an AppSec team, right? And you need to have the skill set of people that are able to do that, integrate with the various tools in your environment and do whatever's needed there. But I think the nature of your question is a little bit more of, to what degree are we writing code for the developers, right? Like common code, as an example, auth and auth type code, whatever's needed, whatever we feel like is needed for the engineering teams to call and utilize as part of the code that they write. I actually don't find that we typically have time to do that, because in my mind, to write it is to maintain it. Okay. Which means you now have to have essentially kind of this two pizza team, 8-ish developers who are going to be actively working on this stuff all the time, maintaining this and so on. I think you can get there. I think in my mind, it's always been a goal to get there where we're actually helping developers write code. But I have not reached that point yet. And I think it's a time issue. So where I typically find my teams is more on the guidance side. How can we write good standards? How do we provide good guidance? How do we do the threat modeling needed to really open people's eyes when it comes to writing this stuff correctly themselves, as opposed to doing it for them?
In terms of secure practices for development, or just baking it into the process?
Exactly. Yeah, and I think the other common issue here is you've got a lot of development teams who are potentially doing different things. I think that you have to have a very methodical engineering team in general to even have sort of those common security focused libraries across your company, because a lot of folks end up finding solutions themselves for the various products that they have and so on. So yeah, so I think that's a bit of a prereq as well, as having the type of engineering org who would respond really well to common libraries, which I think is uncommon. I think in possibly larger companies, especially engineering focused companies, you'll find that, but in a lot of companies, you're not going to find that.
Dale, do you approach it similarly?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was a developer, my first transition out of development was cloud engineering, because all our apps were going to microservice architecture. And I was asked to provide software practices and an SLC process to the DevOps. And I wound up writing a lot of Terraform, CloudFormation, CDKs, things like this. Then when I focused more on security, I try not to program. It's hard. It's tempting because I'll always be a programmer at heart. But where I find myself, like even last week, was the SDLC goes beyond just the developers. And one of the pushes, maybe I'm a little pedantic about it, is infrastructure as code. And so I'm also trying to teach that to the DevOps teams and to the developers, because there's oftentimes a gap there. So last week I was teaching Terraform to one of the DevOps people. As an architect, I'm told your sleeves are down. Do not roll them up. But that's not, I can't do that and provide the full stack security thing, because your company may not have automation engineers for security. They may not be able to interface with security products or work with the DevOps teams on how to take every log and ship it to Splunk or things like this. So a lot of times I find myself in those building those bridges to security to connect the developer to the rest of the security department.
Mm-hmm.
I try to do less of it these days, but I'm glad I have that understanding, because I worked as a DevSecOps, and that's my first priority here is putting the sec in DevOps, and that's been the focus for a while. And you know, get these tools, get the security put into the pipelines, get the policies put in place for the secure by design, and building that aspect of it out.
Mhm.
But there's shortcuts I understand as a developer that I can implement the big ticket items and work on the lower ticket items. Whereas, say, a security team just wants to throw a tool out there, call it good, but they don't want to talk about risk. They don't want to talk about developer time. They don't want to talk about a lot of things. So that's where I fight. And sometimes automations is where I wind up learning, doing more coding these days just to help out with that process until we build that function out.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Do either of you think that there are measurable goals in terms of how you measure your teams and the metrics that you give them that help promote this concept of developer advocacy? And I'll give you a quick example of we were talking to a CISO of a large company, and what I was struck by is that they didn't talk about security as a metric at all. They didn't talk about coverage. They talked almost exclusively about developer productivity, about time to ship, in terms of, can I do this without basically being a tax on developers? Can I do this without developers looking at every meeting that they have with me on their calendar as a litigation meeting of, is this urgent? Is this not urgent? Again, I mean, like we come from the world of SCA and pipeline security and secret scanning and all of that. So that's my frame of reference. But the example is if there's an SCA scan, if that produces a lot of false positives, for example, and you have to dig through that, how do you measure the security person there? Do you measure them in the amount of things that get fixed, or do you measure them in how productive the engineer is? Dustin, I can see you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, yeah. It's making me smile because I've gone through, I would say, several iterations of this type of thing, and I want to kind of throw an interesting idea out where I landed. And that is, how do you measure, the nature of your question was, how do you measure kind of the value, right, that the security team is actually giving to the developers? And I actually measure that by measuring how often others get the security folks involved. Okay. And here's the reason. The biggest reason is because if you're just annoying everybody, if you're setting up meetings and people are just annoyed by them, or you're not handling certain situations right, you're not providing value necessarily, people are going to stop talking to you. People are going to stop reaching out to you and asking for help. So I actually measure that directly via tickets. Are people actually involving us in tickets? Are people actually reaching out to us and asking us questions over Slack or otherwise? If they're doing that, that means they do think we are providing value. Otherwise, they wouldn't reach out. So it's
Mhm.
not so much, trying to figure out how do people react when we reach out, but more of the hard metric of, are people actually asking us for help? Are they involving us in things? And there's various ways to measure that, as I was mentioning before. But I find that to be a very good indication of, how effective is our team. Because, and if I see trends downward, like people they're not reaching out to us much anymore, then I know something is wrong, right? Either we're not providing value, we're not connecting with folks, or something else is happening. But that's typically how I measure what you're talking about.
Yeah. What's your take on this, Dale?
Well, metrics is one of these oddball things for me because I'm not a statistician and I'm not a big believer in stats necessarily because they can be manipulated. I look at it, um, I kind of looked at the DevSecOps maturity model. So I have a tendency to start with a baseline of where are they now
Mhm.
and what practices are they adhering to, or what if they adopted? What practices that can we put in there that will help the maturity model of our process? And so the DSOM was a really good way for me to look at it from the DevOps chain, coming from what the developers are doing to how it gets to production. And then along with that is, if the security team has 10 hours of security testing with every check-in, you'll find that people will stop checking in their code. They'll turn things off. I usually go and look at the policy rules that the developers have admin access to, and I find the majority of them are turned off because they don't want the noise. Another metrics I look at, and this is always on the forefront of my mind, is it takes a developer essentially 1 hour to chase down every finding, false positive or not. And if I turn on a new security tool and it dumps out 1,200 CVSS scores that hit the standard scale, where most of them are criticals or highs, just based on CVSS alone, no environmental, no temporal factors, that's 1 hour per developer for 1,500. You show me any modern development corporation that's going to take that many hours to solve the security issues and not go to market. I don't know many that will do that. So the way I'm tackling that and my metrics is how do I better optimize the developer time? And your typical mean time to detect, mean time to restore type of things are valuable. So we may look at when the vulnerabilities are put out, and then when are they mitigated, to see how much the developers are trying to spend their time. One of the best things I can do as an advocate is implement a risk management program. We're looking at things like now exploitability factors, reachability factors, things like this that your company and others are attempting to do, which I consider the next generation of building true risk into it. And the statistic of if a developer attempts to fix everything spit out of a SaaS tool, they'll be trying to mitigate 80% of all CVEs. If you put the risk scores in there, that drops to 12%. That's a huge improvement for the development. Yeah. And so prioritizing and doing the risk factor calculations on there, to me, is something that I can do to help those metrics be more efficient. So finding true risks, not false positives, because those are expensive and there's a lot of them. And that's one of the biggest blockers to an AppSec program. Is the first thing I always hear is, well, the SaaS tools always spit out too many false positives and it's a waste of our time, so we don't want to use it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how do you improve upon that? And I think the market is turning more to the risk-based side of this and getting off of just pure CVSS scores for doing all their mitigation work.
Yeah, we often see it as you had first generation of application security tools where it was security at all costs and a lot of gates and kind of that waterfall paradigm that you described, without a lot of understanding of, is this slowing down my development? Then you had a second generation of, okay, this is integrated security. We're putting this into the development workflow, but we're producing a lot of false positives. So a lot of the slowdown happened at the right end of it. Of I have to sift through all of these alerts to see what I'm actually prioritizing. And then the generation that we're in now is, okay, how do these tools actually make developers more productive? How do we use things like EPSS and reachability? Some companies do it with program analysis like us, and some will do it with runtime analysis to basically reach that goal.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes both, because, if you want to go defense in depth and you're allowed to have a budget that'll get you things like interactive application security testing, or even a SaaS tool that works properly. Um, those are hurdles. There's a lot of religious discussions, as I call them, and within the security department, and one that I'm in right now that I try and communicate to the security side of the house is, you have to be more agile in your compliance policies and your security programs, because the developers now are going agile. and our security department's more of a waterfall process. And it's typically poured in concrete. And it's not keeping up with the pace of developers and the pace of development, especially if you're only releasing once a year, great. But if you're trying to do multiple releases a day,
Yeah.
how do you fit a security program into that? So,
So
Yep.
the
And I'm happy to see tools popping up too, to your point, Ron, that focus on efficiency, providing results that are relevant to developers as opposed to just blasting them with as many things as folks can find. I think that as the tool can find, right? I think that that's kind of an older mindset that we're now seeing a shift away from, right? Which is great to see, because I think folks are realizing that dumping thousands of issues on developers is not going to work out very well. So I think we are evolving when it comes to that.
Yeah. So the last thing I want us to go through is I want us to revisit something from the previous LeanAppSec. So we talked a lot about education, and we talked a lot about how you need to educate both your internal InfoSec teams, whether you report into those teams or into the CTO. And also, of course, we spent a lot of time talking about champions programs on other sessions. One of our sessions that we did on the previous LeanAppSec, we took a look at a company that we made up, but I wish was real, called Whisker Wellness. This is a pet management platform, empowering pet owners with comprehensive software to track and enhance their pet's lifestyle and nutrition. This is a software company that has grown a lot since the last LeanAppSec. And I want to spend this last section of this session talking about how we would consult this company on setting up their AppSec program for success with developer advocacy, with a champions program. So just to give you an overview of where this company is, we're talking about anywhere between 700 and 1,000 employees total. Out of those, a very large engineering team, because this is a software company. This is the cutting edge of pet management here that we're talking about. However, even though we have anywhere between 200 and 300 developers on the team here, a very small application security team. We see this a lot in a lot of companies. We have 2, maybe 3 people on the AppSec team. Tech stack, last time we were talking about a big monolith to microservices migration, moving to the cloud, moving to containers, JavaScript, Ruby. We talked about languages and all of that in the previous session. In this structure, we did have AppSec reporting to the CTO, but I will add that since then, that did create a bit of friction. As you said, the CTO, she's all about technology. She's all about shipping, right? So that maybe creates a little bit of unaligned goals in terms of security. So I want to throw out a very broad question. And Dustin, let's start with you. What are the first questions that you would ask in order to identify both inefficiencies in the process there, or to identify relationship problems between AppSec and engineering? Where would you start your audit of this company?
Yeah, like just rolling in, trying to figure out where we stand in terms of AppSec.
Mm-hmm.
I would definitely start by having conversations with folks on the engineering side to figure out what is the reputation of security in general. How important is it in folks' minds, and how has the AppSec team performed so far, to try to figure out where those pain points are. And I think those can get uncovered pretty quickly, especially with some very direct questions, right? Is the AppSec team providing value? In what cases have you taken, the advice of the AppSec team? Can you show, where specific value has been added, and so on. And I think that'll expose likely some issues pretty quickly, especially if they don't have kind of that developer advocacy approach that we've talked about. I think you're going to hear a lot of, well, they just throw things over the wall at us, or they gave us thousands of issues and it's going to take us forever to sort through them. This is all kind of, I'm playing along with this scenario, right? So let's say some of those results pop up, and then I think we can go from there.
Okay, so let's say that that is exactly the case. They've been sending a lot of this over the wall without a lot of prioritization, like you mentioned, Dale. That is either environmental, temporal. These are basically your classic. Everything is critical, and you have to fix it, right? Because we can't have critical issues. So where do you begin to help them fix something like that? Let's go to you, Dale.
Um, well, I want to back up a second to One Whisker Wellness and my thoughts on what I would look at coming in there. If I could rewind that just a minute.
Yeah.
You have an awful lot of developers, and the first thing that does is tells me that they're siloed. And the reason being is they're not all on the same team. They'll anymore, the teams will be broken up as front end, middleware, business functionality, data, and all these things. So now you've got to multiply the product by the number of silos, that are trying to be coordinated and put together to get that out the door. And there's very few of us in AppSec. And one thing that wasn't mentioned is, do the AppSec people also have corporate security that they're dealing with? Corporate applications, third-party risk, things like this. So, this tells me that they're out of balance. So it'll be really hard to bring that back into balance. And that's where, back to the topic of this discussion, is the security champions on each of those silos, because your AppSec people can't be everywhere. And the development teams need to understand that they're responsible for the mitigation of the problems that they're creating. Through the use of open source libraries, through the use of poor coding practices, yada, yada, yada. So this is where I kind of look at it like, where do you start? And I'm going to assume, like, I walk in the door and here's the program, and it's like, hey, Dale, how are you going to fix this? And the first thing, again, like I said earlier on, is adoption. You got to be adopted into the family of the developers, for starters. You got to be seen as their advocate. You need to educate them on what the problems are. When I actually was a developer, I wanted to know what my problems were, and there was no AppSec, so I went off and did pen testing for a while. I figured I'll learn how to break into the bank. So that helped me a lot. It helped me a lot with the way I coded, with the way I designed and architected systems. So, and I think you can't be so prescriptive. And one of the things I kind of dislike about security is it's black and white a lot of the times. Compliance says you will do this. And I don't like to myself approach security AppSec as a black and white function, because that's what I'm used to, where an AppSec guy comes in and says, you will do this. Well, that's going to affect my timeline by 2 weeks. They walk out the door. They don't care. So
Yeah.
I think you have to be adaptive. As an AppSec person, I think you have to be a little bit of a chameleon. You got to advocate for both sides. You got to tell the one side why they need to do the security, and the other side is why we need to educate and provide the proper tools and stuff for the developers. So that's kind of a hard answer to give in a black and white fashion like that to me. Because it really has to be tailored for the company. You can't pick up a magazine, read it, and say, this is what we're doing. Because it may not work. It may not get adopted. So
yeah, I mean, what we're talking about here is shifting the culture and shifting the mindset. And I think the best place to start with that is finding allies, finding people in the company, across the company, that are already thinking this way to a degree, and start working with them so that they can become advocates to spread that across the culture in general. So to get a little more granular on what Dale was saying, like in terms of how to start, I think it starts with a lot of conversations and literally finding the people who are already on board with the mission, right? Because there are types that stand out. There's people who say, yeah, I've been trying to get, people to take quality more seriously for a while now. And you're like, bingo, let's work together. How do we work together, right? To kind of start pushing for this. And I think that's the beginning of your champion program, right? You start to find those champions by finding those allies, and then you can watch it spread from there. I don't think it works necessarily to just start pointing at people and prescribing them as champions.
Mhm.
Hey, you're a champion now. And they don't necessarily have any interest in doing so. So, again, that first step is filtering and finding allies and then going from there.
Yeah.
That's I agree with that 100%. And that's the first thing I did when I got here is the first people I went out and talked to were, we have multiple lines of businesses. And I went out and talked to each business information system officer and got them to be an ally. And by going out there interviewing leadership and key stakeholders, I found out there was an incredible appetite for this. There just wasn't an idea of how to proceed with making it happen. And as an architect in my company, I'm actually a director level role. So, which is fun and interesting, but I'm director level without a budget and without any authority. I'm advisory only. So making allies is very important. I got to go find the people that have one, the authority to work with compliance with me and those that have money to work with the program.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's all about the relationships and allies that you make, and less about the tactics, right? Less about the tools. I know we're at time, and largely because of me and the questions that I wanted to ask, we didn't get too much time to dig into Whisker Wellness. But just to wrap us up, the CISO at Whisker Wellness, very frustrated, hard job. A lot is being required out of them. Not just AppSec is under them, but also compliance, network security, all the rest of the things that you would imagine. But AppSec is the hot button issue right now. What advice would you leave them with as you send them on their way to correct the ship? I think you've given a lot of advice, but what would you, at the end of the call, kind of sign them away with? Dustin, let's start with you.
Yeah, I would say it's going to take time. Change is hard. Hang in there. Don't jump. Right? Build relationships, build connections, find your allies, and start that ball rolling, and eventually you will get there. So hang in there.
All right. Thank you so much, Dustin. I know you have to drop. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
Dale,
you.
do you have a little piece of advice for our CISO here?
Yeah, as we mentioned, soft skills are important, I think, when you're setting up an AppSec program. I found sage words of advice from somebody ages ago was come with solutions, not problems. And I don't approach these people with FUD or problems. I try and provide solutions, and I give them a roadmap of what the timeline will look like, of what we want to introduce into the project, and when and where and how much is what they always want to know. So
Yeah.
it's important to know where you're going and have a plan.
Yeah. Well, Dustin, Dale, thank you so much for joining me today. I'd love to do a follow-up session to this, but I learned so much. But to everybody watching, if there's anything else that you'd like to see covered from these wonderful people, just let us know, and I'll beg them to come back and do another LeanAppSec session. Thanks, everybody. I hope this has been informative.